Hello, Harvest Time students. This is Pastor Dave coming to you with the second in a series of 4 lectures of a survey of the Old Testament. In our last lecture, we covered the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. All of those books, or all of those names, I should say, relate to those 5 books. And we covered that, Genesis, through the book of Deuteronomy. And we stepped off at the end of Deuteronomy with the death of Moses and the commissioning of Joshua. And the children of Israel, all the second generation, the first generation had died in the wilderness, but the second generation was now waiting on the east side of the Jordan River, preparing to enter into the promised land. The land that God had promised to Abraham and to his descendants. And so they are now getting ready to go into that promised land. Joshua is going to be their leader. His name in Hebrew is Yeshua, which is the same name of Jesus. Jesus is the Greek version of Yeshua. So Yeshua would be the Hebrew pronunciation of his name. So Joshua is going to go before them as their leader, and they're going to go in and as those who are acting out the judgment of God on the people who currently are in the land of Canaan. You'll remember back in Genesis, God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved, and then God would bring them out with a mighty hand, and that they would come back to the land that Abraham was currently sojourning or traveling through, and that they would then possess that land because God would give it to them. But he wouldn't do it until these people, the Canaanites, had filled up the cup of judgment, that all of the wickedness that they were engaged in was ripe for judgment. You'll notice how patient God is with humanity as he waits to bring judgment. He waits 400 years, and the people of Israel are in Egypt all during that time, waiting for God to bring them out of that land and into the land that he promised to Abraham. And so we are now just about ready to do that. And Joshua is organizing the people, and he does the work of renewing the covenant. You'll remember that Israel made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai. Moses brought the 10 Commandments, and they built the tabernacle, and they had a system of relationship where God told them his will, how things were to be, and then how they were to worship him appropriately and come into his presence so that he could dwell among them in the tabernacle, and then they could interact with him through the priests. And so all of that covenant is being restored at this time so that this new generation who are going to enter into the promised land will be able to continue to be obedient to God as they are instructed. And so Joshua begins that process. They have or rather they practice the festival of the Passover when death passed over, because they'd put the blood on the lintel and the doorposts of their homes. And so they remember the reality of God passing over because of the blood. And then God then brings them through the Jordan River as he did the Red Sea, and he parts it as the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant, the container of the 10 Commandments, and the manna and Aaron's rod that was budded were in that container, and they came up to the Jordan River, and the Jordan River stood up in a pile far away. And so God is showing his miraculous power to bring about his result, his desire in this promised land. Now, this would be for Israel, but it would also undoubtedly be known to the peoples around that something incredible had happened, something supernatural had occurred that brought this people into the land of Canaan. And so they walked through on dry land, and then they camped out on the west side of the Jordan River, preparing to start the conquest that Joshua was to lead by driving out the people who were in this land. Now, as you remember, or you probably remember from your reading or just from general knowledge, that Jericho was the first place that they came to, that Jericho was the city that they were going to have to take first before they entered into the rest of the land and moved up into the hill country. So they sent out spies, and before they did that, Joshua was looking around the area, and he is confronted by a man with a sword. And Joshua says to him, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" And the man says, "Neither." And Joshua quickly recognizes that he is not just dealing with a man. And the man says he is the commander of the Lord's army, and he has come. And the thing that this tells us, and the thing that we really need to pay attention to, is that this is God's work. This is not just a tribe of wandering people who are out in the wilderness and they want a home, and so they're going to take this land for themselves. No, this is God's assignment that they are to do. And now there has been a supernatural messenger, I believe Christ before his incarnation, a Christophany or a showing of Jesus before he came later. And he is the commander of the Lord's army, and he has come, and Joshua bows down to him. It's one of the ways that we know that this is not an angel, because he worships him. And so he comes and he tells Joshua, this is what we're going to do. And so we have this setup now for all of the things that are to occur in the book of Joshua. Joshua and the people of Israel are to obey God. They are to follow his instructions as he brings them into the promised land. And he organizes them according to his ways and does all of the things that he intends to do. And so the rest of the book talks about the various places that they go and warfare takes place. And then they also spread out through the land, and God gives them their portion of the promised land. And so the tribes are separated out into their various places. In your Bible, there is usually a map in the back of your Bible that will show roughly the places given to each of the tribes. And then the Levites, those who are of Moses and Aaron's clan, so the priests and those who care for the tabernacle, are then spread out throughout all of the tribes. They are given specific cities, and they are to be the ones who are the stewards or the caretakers of the tabernacle and the teaching of the Old Covenant, of the law, of the Mosaic instructions that God gave throughout the Torah. So we bring Jewish history at that point to the settling in the promised land. And Joshua passes from the scene, and Joshua then dies, and he also, just like Moses, gives kind of a farewell address, and he warns the people, please keep the covenant. You need to keep the covenant, because if you don't, God will withdraw his favor from you and bad things will happen. Just as Moses had said to them, I place before you life and death. Choose life. Choose to obey God. God is the one who has brought you to this place. Don't be foolish and walk away from him and be tempted by the peoples around you and by their gods and the idolatry that so easily entangles. Obey God. Keep covenant, and he will take care of you. Well, if you know about the history of Israel, you recognize that that is not what they did. They were quickly tempted by idolatry. And so we move into the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, we see a cycle that takes place. We see Israel doing well, and then we see them fall down into idolatry, into the worship of foreign gods, who are nothing more really than demons. And so Israel, rather than being faithful to God and walking according to his ways, are worshiping God's enemies, his spiritual enemies, demons. And so God allows them then to be oppressed, to be attacked, and to have hard things happen to them. And when those things happen, they begin to recognize that God is no longer on their side. He is no longer protecting them. And so they cry out to God, and then God raises up what they called a judge, or really I would call him a warrior chieftain, who would be someone who would be raised up to deliver the people from the oppression of the various other tribes around that would attack them. And then they would be in a place where they'd be renewed back into covenant worship with God, and they'd be in a good place. And then they would go through this cycle again. And this cycle repeats multiple times through the book of Judges. And so what we see is that Israel is in need of a center. It needs a place where governance is consistent, and they have the ability to hold the covenant because they have a leader who is consistently before them. So the book of Judges records the failure of that system to adequately lead the people. God wants to be their king, but they're not doing a very good job of following him, and they keep breaking covenant. And so he raises up these judges, and each one does his work, and then as soon as he passes from the scene, they fall right back into idolatry again. And so God has to go through this whole cycle again. When we get to the end of the book of Judges, things are very bad, and there is rampant sin, and terrible things are happening in Israel, and it looks nothing like it's supposed to look in terms of the way God's covenant people would behave. And so Judges, the key phrase is that every man did what was right in his own eyes. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And so every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so we see the need for a central leader, a central figure to bring leadership to the tribes, and to bring some consistency to the obedience of the people enforced by a strong government. That brings us to 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel are the end of the period of the judges. Samuel is the last judge that comes on the scene, and he is a figure who also carries a priestly mantle and a prophetic mantle. And so he has all of these in his domain. He is to carry all of those. And so he operates as a warrior at times, he operates as a priest at times, and he operates as a prophet or a spokesman for God. Samuel, as he moves through time and leads Israel, they're doing pretty well, but they want a king, and they demand a king of him and ask him to set a king over them to lead them into battle. And they use this phrase, and this really troubles Samuel. They use the phrase, anoint for us a king, set aside for us a king who will be like the other nations and lead us. Now, this really troubles Samuel because Samuel knows that God's people are not to be like any of the other people around them. They're to be a special people. They're to be a priestly nation who are to represent God's ways and God's values to the rest of the nations around. But God says no to Samuel. He says, go ahead and do as they say and give them a king. And so King Saul is brought from among the people, from the tribe of Benjamin, and he is anointed or set aside as God's representative of government. And so he is the king. Samuel is still alive during this time, but Saul takes over the position of governor and of leading the government and also leading the military, leading the army that protects Israel. And Saul is a very effective warrior. He does a very good job in battle. But his main failure is that he fails to obey God in every detail. He forgets that indeed he is God's representative and God is in fact Israel's king. And so when God tells Saul what he is to do in preparing for battle, and then afterwards with the spoils, you need to read the book, 1 Samuel, he rejects Saul as king because Saul does not obey God completely. And so Samuel is given the task of going to anoint a new king. Now, Saul is still the king. God has not rejected him as yet in terms of actually removing the kingdom from his hand, but God has pulled away his favor from Saul, and God is no longer with him. Samuel is sent to the house of Jesse, and he goes to the house of Jesse, and Jesse has many sons, and they are put before him. And Samuel prays, and he goes through each one, and God says, no, I have not chosen him. No, I have not chosen him. No, I have not chosen him. And finally, when he comes to the last son that is standing before him, Samuel asks Jesse, do you have any other sons? Because God has not chosen these young men. And Jesse says, well, only the youngest, but he's out with the sheep. And so David is called in, and he is anointed as king. Now, he is probably 13, 14 years old. He's a very young man at this point, or really a boy. And he is anointed as king. And he obviously was not held in high esteem by his family because they didn't even bring him in when Samuel came to the house. But he was esteemed by God. And God says, Samuel, don't look at the outside, but look at the inside. And God knew David's heart, that he had a heart that was fully devoted to him. And so he began to shape David's life and prepare him to be the king of Israel. David was called to care for his brothers at one time when Saul was preparing for battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines had a giant, a huge warrior by the name of Goliath. And David is asked by his father to take provisions to his brothers who are with the army of Israel, and they are faced off with the Philistines. And they have not engaged in battle, but Goliath comes out day after day and insults Israel, and he insults the God of Israel. Now, when David is delivering provisions, he hears of this. He hears this insult, and he is moved by the Spirit of God. He is incensed by the fact that this uncircumcised, meaning man that is not part of the covenant, people of God, would insult the God of Israel, that he has raised up in pride his attitude and hand against the God of Israel. So David volunteers to King Saul. This is King Saul's job, by the way. He is to lead the armies, but he has not the courage, and God's favor has lifted off of him. But David now, unbeknownst to Saul, has been anointed as the next king. He steps up and volunteers as God's representative to fight Goliath. David is a shepherd. He is not a warrior. He is a youth. He's a young man. very young, not even old enough to have been called to the army at this point. But he insists that he will do it and that he will go and fight this Goliath. God will empower him to do it. As a shepherd, he says, I have killed both a lion and a bear that have attacked my sheep, and I have killed them, and this giant will be like one of them. And so God's Spirit has so filled David with courage that he is ready, and God has prepared him for this moment. And it says that when David comes and he hears this Goliath again speaking against God, that he gets his sling. He has a slingshot, or the ability to sling it. It would be a sling of stone. It would be a couple of pieces of rope with a little pouch. And he had undoubtedly practiced and practiced and practiced. And so he gathered stones and he ran to the battle, and he runs toward Goliath and he slings the stone, and it hits Goliath, apparently right in the forehead, and knocks him out, or it actually crushes his skull. And David takes Goliath's sword and he removes Goliath's head, and Israel is saved, and they rout the Philistine army. In this way, David is brought into Israel's national consciousness, into their awareness that he is a great warrior of God, and he is going to be used of God. None of them know that he has been anointed, but we learn more and more about him as the rest of the book goes on. It turns out that Saul becomes very jealous of David because he recognizes that God is on David and is empowering David to do these things. But Saul wants to keep his kingdom, and he wants to give it to his son Jonathan, even though God has anointed another. And so we see Saul attacking David many times, even chasing him off into the wilderness, until such time as David is going to be brought into the place of becoming the king. There's much to say about this, but this is an overview, so I'm not going to give you all the details. But David refuses to take matters into his own hands. He waits for God. He is very patient for God to do his work. David runs from Saul for roughly 13 years before Saul and Jonathan are both killed in battle, and then David is brought in to be the king of the people. First Judah, and then the rest of Israel, and he is installed as the king. David brings the tabernacle of God into Jerusalem, and he dances with all of his might before the Lord. And David is the one who writes the Psalms, and so he is a warrior. He is a king, but he is also a musician. He is also a lyricist who writes music. And he also is prophetic, and he gives prophetic words which are recorded in the book of Psalms. So David takes Jerusalem and he makes it his capital, and he brings the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God's presence, into the city to be the center of both religious and political life in Israel. So we talked about previously the judges, where things were okay for a while, and then they would go very far down, and every man did what was right in his own eyes, for Israel had no king. But David is now brought into this place, and he is the greatest of the kings of Israel in his faithfulness to God. He is far from perfect. He sins in some fairly substantial ways, but he is nonetheless honored by God and given a promise by God that his line will go on forever if they will obey God. And there will be one raised up who will come from David's line, who will reign forever. And we know that to be Jesus Christ. For Jesus, if you look at the genealogies in the Gospels, Jesus is a descendant of David, both legally and physically from Mary's side, Jesus is a descendant of David. And so God makes that promise to David, and then that comes to pass in the person of Jesus Christ, who is the Lord of all and who will rule the earth forever. David passes from the scene having prepared to build a more permanent dwelling place for God. God does not let David build him a temple, because he says that David is a man of blood, that he has spilled much blood. He has indeed been quite the warrior, and he has fought many, many battles. And so God says you can prepare for it, but you cannot build it. Another will do so. And so his son Solomon, King Solomon, builds the temple. And we see this in the books of First Kings and First Chronicles. Those books run in parallel together about the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. And we learn a lot about, again, God's dealings with his people and with how he keeps bringing them back to covenant relationship with himself. One of the very interesting parts of the book of First Chronicles is where Solomon builds the temple, and he begins to dedicate it to God, and God's presence shows up in the same way that it did at the tabernacle, so much so that the priests are driven out of the place because they can't even stay, because God's presence is so intense. But I want you to see that in various ways throughout Israel's history, God shows himself in very tangible ways, miraculous ways, supernatural ways, to show his people that he is with them and that he approves of them and that he wants to be near to them. And so there's a great prayer from Solomon, and there are other instances where God does things in this way through his prophets. So as you read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I want you to specifically note the historical things that take place, because they cover over 300 years of time of the kings of Israel. But what they show is God's desire to really be the ultimate king of his people, and the human kings to be his representatives. The nations are split in two during this time. There is a northern group of tribes that follow a man named Jeroboam, and the southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that follow the line of David and Solomon's son Rehoboam. And most of the Levitical tribe, the Levites, are mostly in Judah as well. But unfortunately, as we go through these books and we look at them, they tend to follow the exact same pattern as the Judges. Things are going fairly well, and Israel and Judah would keep covenant, and then things would fall down into idolatry, and God would bring judgment against them, and then they would cry out to God. The prophets would speak to them about what God wanted, where they were breaking covenant, where they were sinning against God, and then God would try to draw them back. The northern tribes had one bad king after another. None of them kept covenant. They completely went into idolatry, and they all acted wickedly against God. The southern tribes had some good kings and some very bad kings. And so we see that same pattern as we did in Judges. Eventually, both nations, as Moses had warned them in Deuteronomy, that if they failed to keep covenant, that God would lift his hand of protection and he would remove them from his land because they refused to keep covenant. And so first the northern tribe was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and then eventually the southern tribe of Judah is also conquered by the Babylonians, who conquered the Assyrians and then conquered Jerusalem. And they take them into exile. And that is how those books end, is with the final kings of Judah who are taken into exile into Babylon. So we see that this land that God is giving through Joshua's leadership to his people doesn't belong to them. It belongs to God. And God has said, if you're going to be in my promised land, you are going to be covenant keepers. You're going to be those who operate under my leadership, under my protection. No human being can protect you. I have to protect you. This is a spiritual battle. And the gods of the nations are nothing more than demons, and they are moved and directed by Satan, and they will attack you, and I will allow them to oppress you if you do not keep covenant with me. Because if you worship those same demons, then you are not my people. Now let's step back and think about this for a minute. Remember what God promised in Genesis chapter 3, that he was going to bring a seed through the woman who was going to come, and he was going to crush the head of the serpent while he was bit on the heel by the serpent. God is working out his promise. He brought Abraham to this promised land. He then promised this land not only to Abraham, but to his descendants. He then gave that land to his descendants. They were in the land, but they did not keep faith. They were not obedient to him. And so he allows them to be conquered, and they go out in exile, meaning they are removed from his land. Now, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, known as Israel, does not really come back to the land. They are scattered throughout the ancient Middle East. Judah goes off into exile, and they are in exile in Babylon, until Babylon itself, then, that empire is conquered. And it is conquered by the Persians and the Medes. That empire then takes over. And that group of people that were taken into exile were exiled for 70 years. The prophet Jeremiah warned them that God would exile them for 70 years until the land had its Sabbath days that it had been promised in the book and in the law of Moses. And so after those years were up, God enabled them to be returned, some of them, a remnant, to come back into the promised land. And so Ezra, the scribe, brings them into this promised land. Ezra organizes the people according to the laws of Moses, and he brings them into the land. And they reestablish the worship of God. They build an altar, and eventually they build a temple, much smaller, of course, than what Solomon had built. But they begin to worship God again in this chosen place, Jerusalem, Mount Zion, very, very close to where Isaac would have been offered to God by Abraham, in this same exact spot, in this same location. And so God is being worshiped again in this place. The book of Ezra gives all the details of that period of time. The Persians had a different policy among the people that were conquered in their empire, and they actually encouraged the Jews to return back to Jerusalem and to the nation of Judah, so that they could then offer sacrifice to their God, so that their God would show favor to the Persian kings. And so that was their policy, and that is what they did. So Ezra reinstituted the law and the worship and began to train the people. A man named Zerubbabel was the governor over the area during this period of time. After this time, a man named Nehemiah is also allowed to come. You'll note that these are the names of the books that you should be reading in the books of history in this section of the Old Testament survey. Nehemiah comes. He is a confidant. He is a close servant of the king of Persia. And he is allowed, he's a cupbearer to the king, he is allowed to come back to Jerusalem and to rebuild its walls. And he functions as a governor for a period of time while the walls of the city are rebuilt. An ancient city in this period of time would be completely defenseless against foreign invaders, against bandits, against anybody, because they didn't have a wall. In ancient times, when you had a wall around a city, you could go there to retreat if an army attacked, and you would be protected. And even just at night, they could close the gates and be protected from marauders, from those who would seek to plunder the people. And so Jerusalem is being still oppressed during Ezra's time, even though the worship has been reestablished. And so Nehemiah comes as somewhat of more of almost a military figure, but certainly a governance figure, to reestablish protection for the city of Jerusalem and for the people of Judah. He is very successful at reestablishing a protective cordon around them, and the wall is rebuilt and the gates are hung, and the city is now reestablished, and it is in a much better place. In between Ezra and Nehemiah, there is one figure that is very critical for the protection of the people of Israel, and this is Queen Esther. Queen Esther is brought into the royal court. She becomes a queen. She's Jewish, and she is married to a Persian king. There is, during the time of Ezra, a plot made by a man named Haman to kill all of the Jews. He is going to commit genocide. He is a picture, really, of an antichrist figure, of a satanic figure who wants to fully attack God's promise to bring Messiah, to bring the seed of the woman, and to save humanity. And so this man Haman makes a plan and gets the king to agree to it, to kill all of the Jews. And the Jews are very afraid, of course, and they appeal to a man named Mordecai, who is a Jewish man, who then speaks to Queen Esther. Queen Esther is able to get the king's ear and let him know that she is Jewish, and that this plot that Haman has hatched and has brought against her people is going to kill her as well. And so the king reverses this situation, defends the people, the Jewish people, and God's people are saved. This is a very critical story. It's a very important story for Israel, because if Israel or Judah doesn't survive, then the Messiah can't come, because he's going to come through God's chosen people, the one who are chosen to bring God's answer to reconciliation, God's answer to the sin and rebellion of humanity. Jesus comes through the Jews. So we've covered most of the historical books. We skipped over the book of Ruth, but there's a little vignette during the time of the Judges where there is a woman who is a foreigner, And there is a little story about her choosing to become a Jewish person, choosing to become a member of the covenant people of God. She is from the land of Moab, but she becomes a Jew. She is the great grandmother of King David. And so she's a very important figure. You'll find her also in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospels, because she is an ancestor of King David. So what I want you to see is I want you to just back up a little bit and look at this big picture of what God is doing. God has created human beings to have relationship with them, but we quickly rebelled against him. But God makes a promise that he will bring, through the woman, he will bring a seed. And that seed will crush the head of the serpent, Satan, but he will be wounded in the process. He then goes about working his plan. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Samuel, the judges, King David. He's bringing us forward, all the way forward, to bring us to a time when it's right to bring Messiah, the anointed one, who will rule forever in righteousness as God's representative and as a representative of humanity. And so we look forward to, in the books we have yet to study, we've yet to get to, we look forward to his coming. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the writings. We're going to look at the Psalms, or the books of poetry, the Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Proverbs. These are also sometimes called the wisdom books. And so we're going to look at those next time. Within those books, there are many allusions or foreshadowings of Messiah, particularly in the Psalms, especially in the Psalms. Many of them are quoted by Jesus. Some of them are quoted by Jesus when he's actually hanging on the cross. And he's actually, if you will, letting them know, I am the Messiah. I am the one that this psalm is speaking of. And so we're going to cover those books in the next lecture. So I hope this has been fruitful for you. I really strongly encourage you. Please read these books. You need to understand them. Just hearing my lecture or reading the Harvest Time outlines is not enough. You need to read these books. If you don't have a lot of time right now, you can skim them to begin with and then read them in more detail later. But I would strongly encourage you to read them. Understanding the historical books allows you to understand much more of what is happening in the prophetic books and also even in the Gospels. Because if you understand Israel's history, then you understand what the prophets are speaking to, the political situation, the moral and religious situation of Israel that's being addressed by the prophets. You'll also recognize much of the behavior of the apostles or the disciples, later the apostles, and Jesus during the time of the Gospels, because they, of course, are a living extension of the history of Israel, only we're more familiar with them in the New Testament. So understanding this history and understanding the exile is very important. So please take the time to read the books and place it in order. Well, I pray that God helps you as you carry forth with your studies. It's been a blessing to add this lecture to the library, and I pray that you're keeping up and moving on with your studies. God bless you, and I'll look forward to talking to you the next time.